The sound of a hand against a face is louder than people expect. It cracks. It echoes off the ceiling of a dining room the way a gunshot echoes off canyon walls, and for one full second, nobody in that room breathed. I stood there with my cheek burning and my daughter's fork frozen halfway to her mouth, and my grandson, 6 years old, staring up at his Aunt Carol like she just turned into someone he didn't recognize. "You're not even her real family," Carol said, her voice shaking, pointing a finger that still had my face's sting on her palm. "You never were. You just married in. 31 years. 31 Thanksgivings. 31 tax seasons where I sat at Eleanor's father's kitchen table with a calculator and a legal pad, making sure the man's small business didn't drown him in penalties. 31 years of being the son-in-law who showed up early to help set up chairs and stayed late to help fold them away. And in front of my grandchildren, in the dining room where I'd carved 100 turkeys, Carol had just slapped me and told the whole family I didn't belong in it. What she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that I had spent the last 11 months with her father's leather ledger open on my kitchen table every night after Eleanor went to bed, and I already had the proof that would end her husband's career and her marriage right along with it. She just didn't know I was patient enough to wait for the right room to say it in. My name is Frank Kessler. I'm 69 years old. I spent 38 years as a forensic accountant, the last 15 of them testifying in courtrooms about exactly the kind of thing I was about to find in my own family. I've sat across from embezzling business partners, skimming bookkeepers, and executors who quietly helped themselves to an estate before the rest of the family ever saw full accounting. I always assumed that expertise was something I'd use for other people's families, other people's tragedies, filed away in bankers' boxes and close cases. I never once imagined I'd end up opening my own father-in-law's ledger under a lamp at my kitchen table, looking for the same kind of quiet theft I'd spent a career exposing in strangers. And this is the story of the year my wife's family decided I wasn't real family, and the year I proved, with their own numbers, exactly how real I was. I need to back up, because you have to understand who I was before that slap landed, or none of what came after will make sense. I married Eleanor Whitfield in 1991. Her father, Walter Whitfield, ran a small hardware store outside of Lansing for 40 years and raised two daughters, Eleanor, the oldest, steady and quiet, and Carol, 6 years younger, the one who always needed a little more attention and never quite got enough of it. Walter was a good man, gruff in the way men of his generation were gruff, but he loved his girls fiercely. And somewhere in my second year of marriage, he started loving me too, in his own quiet way. He'd call me on Sunday nights just to ask what I thought about the stock market. He'd hand me his store's books every March, not because he needed to, but because he liked having someone in the family who understood numbers the way he understood lumber and nails. When Carol married Roger Danvers in 1998, Walter never quite warmed to him the way he'd warmed to me. Roger sold insurance, then he sold timeshares, then he sold something to do with commercial real estate that nobody in the family ever fully understood, and every few years he had a new business card and a new story about the big deal that was about to change everything. Walter used to say, quietly, over coffee, that he worried about Carol. He never said why. He didn't have to. Walter died in the spring, 4 years ago, at 86, in the house he'd lived in for 50 years, with Eleanor holding one hand and Carol holding the other. I was in the kitchen making coffee nobody drank. That's the kind of family member I was useful, present, and just outside the frame. He left behind a modest estate. Not a fortune, but not nothing. The hardware store had sold years before he died, and the proceeds, along with his savings and a small life insurance payout, went into a family trust, the Whitfield Family Trust, meant to be split evenly between Eleanor and Carol, with a smaller portion set aside for the grandchildren's education, to be released over time. Walter had insisted on a trust instead of a simple will because, he told me once, over that same Sunday coffee, wills get fought over, trusts get managed. He asked me gently, whether I'd be willing to serve as an informal advisor to whoever the successor trustee turned out to be, since I understood the accounting better than anyone else in the family. I said, of course. I never expected to need to use that. The trust named Eleanor and Carol as co-trustees in keeping with Walter's belief that sisters should manage their inheritance together as equals. It was a decision made with love and without much foresight, because within a year of Walter's death, Carol was signing withdrawal requests that Eleanor never saw, and Roger was the one filling in the numbers. I want to be fair to Carol here, because it would be easy to make her into a cartoon, and she wasn't one. Carol had spent her whole life feeling like the second daughter, the one who got the hand-me-down piano lessons, the one whose report cards were compared to Eleanor's, the one who, even at 51 years old, still fought for her father's attention at every holiday table. When Walter died, something in Carol broke that never quite reset. She grieved hard, and she grieved angry, and somewhere in that grief she convinced herself that the trust was the last measurable proof of how much her father had loved her, and that if her half of it wasn't bigger, wasn't better managed, wasn't more impressive than Eleanor's, it meant she'd lost the argument she'd been having with her sister since she was 7 years old. That's not an excuse for what she did, but it's the truth of who she was, and I never forgot it, even in the worst of what came later. Roger is a harder man to be generous about, but I'll try. He wasn't born a con man. He was, by most accounts, a hard-working kid from a family with nothing, who clawed his way into a series of sales jobs because it was the only ladder available to him, and who genuinely believed every single time that the next deal was the one that would finally make him solid. I think Roger loved Carol. I think he hated, more than almost anything, the quiet way her family looked at him like a man who'd never quite arrived. And I think that hatred, mixed with a gambling habit he kept mostly hidden and a string of business failures he couldn't keep hidden, made him desperate in a way that desperate men often become dangerous. The disrespect didn't start with a slap. It built the way water builds behind a dam, one small crack at a time. The first crack came 8 months after Walter's funeral, at Eleanor's 60th birthday dinner. Carol stood up to give a toast, and she talked for almost 5 minutes about family legacy and honoring what Dad built and keeping everything in the bloodline where it belongs, and in 5 minutes of talking about her father's legacy, she never once said Walter's name. Not once. I sat there watching her toast to a man she wouldn't name, in a room where I was the only person who noticed, and something cold settled into my stomach that had nothing to do with the wine. The second crack came that Christmas when the family photographer arranged everyone for the annual portrait Walter used to insist on every year. Carol quietly told the photographer the immediate bloodline should be in the front row, meaning Eleanor, Carol, and the grandchildren, and gestured for me to stand in the back behind my own children like a photobomb she was tolerating. Eleanor didn't notice. I did. I stood in the back and smiled for the camera and said nothing, because I still believed, foolishly, that patience was the same thing as peace. The third crack came in February, when I found out not from Carol, not from Eleanor, but from my own daughter, who'd heard it from a cousin that there had been a trust reading and planning meeting with the family's estate attorney, and I hadn't been invited. Eleanor hadn't even known about it until after it happened. Carol had scheduled it for a weekday afternoon when she knew Eleanor would be at her volunteer shift at the hospital. And she'd walked in alone with Roger and the attorney, and by the time anyone else found out, decisions had already been discussed about restructuring the trust's investment approach going forward. There was a fourth crack, and this one I almost didn't notice at all, which is exactly why it mattered. It happened at my own granddaughter's high school graduation party that same spring, in the parking lot of the restaurant where I'd gone to get a sweater out of my car. Roger was out there too, phone pressed to his ear, his back half turned, and his voice had a pitch to it I'd never heard from him before, tight, low, almost pleading. "I told you I'm handling it," he said. "Just give me until next month. I've got a property closing. It's practically done." A pause then. quieter, angrier. Don't call me at family things. He hung up, saw me standing by my car, and his face did something fast and practiced, sliding from panic to salesman's charm in under a second, the way I imagine it had slid 100 times before for 100 different creditors. "Everything all right out here, Frank?" he asked, too brightly. I said everything was fine. I filed the tightness in his voice away without understanding yet what it meant, the way you note a number that doesn't quite add up long before you know what it's hiding. Inside, 20 minutes later, the sting came from somewhere I didn't expect. The private room's bill arrived at the head of the table, and Roger reached for it with a flourish, announcing he had it for the family, and slid his card across to the waiter like a man buying everyone's gratitude in one motion. The waiter came back a minute later and murmured something in his ear. Roger's card had been declined. He laughed too loudly, said something about his bank flagging out-of-state charges, and reached for a second card that also didn't go through. I quietly handed the waiter my own card before anyone else at the table fully registered what was happening, and Roger clapped me on the shoulder a little too hard and said, loud enough for the table to hear, "See, this is why we keep Frank around good in a pinch, even if he's not exactly blood." A few people laughed. Carol didn't. She just looked at her plate. I smiled and said nothing, and underneath the smile I thought about a man who couldn't cover a family dinner tab, making regular six-figure decisions, on paper, as an informal advisor to his wife's family trust. That was the moment I stopped being patient and started being careful. There's a difference, and it took me most of my career to learn it. Patient people wait for things to get better on their own. Careful people wait for the moment when waiting will actually pay off. I didn't say anything to Eleanor yet. I didn't want to hand her a fight based on a feeling. I've spent 38 years in forensic accounting, learning one rule above all others: feelings don't hold up in front of a judge, and neither do suspicions. Numbers do. So I asked Eleanor casually one evening whether her father had left behind any of his old record books, not the trust documents, just his personal ledgers, the ones he'd kept by hand for decades out of habit, long after everything went digital. She found them in a box in her closet. Among them was the one that would matter most, a worn leather ledger, its spine cracked white, that Walter had used every year of his life to track the family's finances in his own handwriting right up until the trust took over. I asked if I could borrow it, told her I wanted to look through it for sentimental reasons, to remember him. That part was true. I just didn't tell her the rest of what I was planning to do with it. That ledger became the thread I pulled on for the next 11 months, and it sat on my kitchen table every single night, its worn leather cover open under the same lamp Walter used to read his newspaper by when he visited us. I'd trace his old handwritten totals against the trust's current statements, page by page, the way I used to reconcile a company's books against its bank records back when I still had a badge that said Forensic Examiner on it. Walter's numbers were meticulous, down to the dollar. The trust's numbers, once Carol and Roger took over managing distributions, were not. The first anomaly I found was small enough to miss if you weren't looking for it. A withdrawal of exactly $4,000 made 11 months after Walter's death, coded in the trust's records as Property Maintenance Lake Cottage. I knew that cottage. I'd spent 20 summers there. It didn't cost $4,000 to maintain a 2-bedroom cottage with a window air conditioner and a dock that needed new boards every few years. I made a note and kept reading. The second anomaly was bigger. 6 months after the first one, another withdrawal, this one for $11,200, coded as trust administration and legal fees. I called the family's actual estate attorney myself under the guise of asking a general question about trust administration costs for an article I was supposedly reviewing for a friend. He confirmed, without knowing what he was confirming, that his firm's total billing on the Whitfield Trust for that entire year had come to just under $2,000. Someone had padded a legal fee line by more than $9,000 and called it routine. Somewhere around month 6 of that quiet nightly work, I started applying something older than any of my career's fancier tools, a principle called Benford's Law, which states that in almost any naturally occurring set of financial figures, certain leading digits appear far more often than others. Because real transactions accumulate messily, in fits and starts, not in tidy round numbers. Fabricated figures invented by a person trying to look legitimate rather than generated by real chaotic commerce tend to cluster suspiciously around round numbers 4,000, 11,000, 14,000 instead of following that natural distribution. When I ran Walter's decades of real handwritten hardware store transactions against the pattern, they behaved exactly the way real numbers should: messy, uneven, mathematically alive. When I ran the 7 trust withdrawals against that same pattern, every single one of them landed suspiciously close to a round figure, the way invented numbers always do. It wasn't proof on its own. No forensic accountant worth his license ever treats one method as a verdict, but it was the first sign, months before I ever laid eyes on a signature under magnification, that somebody had been inventing these numbers rather than earning them. By the time I'd worked through 11 months of statements, I had found a pattern of withdrawals, 7 of them, ranging from $3,000 to just over $14,000 each, all coded as maintenance, administration, or trust investment diversification, totaling just over $1,000. Every single one of them had been authorized with what looked, at a glance, like Eleanor's signature. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it, because a signature isn't just a name. In forensic accounting, we spend entire careers learning to read a signature the way a doctor reads an X-ray, not for what it says, but for what it doesn't say. A real signature has variation. It has the small tremors and inconsistencies of a living hand moving at speed, forming letters the same way it's formed them 10,000 times before, but never in exactly the same rhythm twice. A traced or copied signature, by contrast, is unnaturally consistent. The pen pressure doesn't waver where a real signature wavers. The letter spacing repeats itself with a precision no human hand produces naturally, because the forger isn't signing a name, they're copying a shape. I laid all 7 withdrawal authorizations side by side on my kitchen table under a magnifying lamp I'd bought 40 years ago for exactly this kind of work, and I found what I already suspected I'd find. Eleanor's real signature, the one I'd watched her write 10,000 times across birthday cards and school permission slips and our own marriage license, had a small, distinctive hitch in the capital E, a tiny hesitation, almost a double stroke, that she'd had since I met her. Every one of the 7 trust withdrawal signatures had that same hitch, in exactly the same place, at exactly the same angle, down to the pixel. A real signature doesn't repeat itself perfectly 7 times over 11 months. A traced one does. Eleanor hadn't signed those withdrawals. Someone else had copied her signature from a document they already had, likely her original acceptance letter as co-trustee, and traced it 7 separate times. I let that reveal sit by itself for a long moment before I let myself think about what it meant, because that's the discipline of the work. You don't stack conclusions. You let each one breathe before you build the next one on top of it. I closed the ledger that night and didn't open it again for 3 days, because I needed to be certain I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see. When I came back to it with clear eyes, the hitch in that E was still there, 7 times over, exactly the same. The next question was simpler and harder at once. Where had $61,000 gone? Trust withdrawals have to land somewhere, I requested, quietly, through a former colleague still working at a regional bank compliance office, someone who owed me a favor from a case 15 years earlier and who could legally point me toward publicly recorded filings without crossing any lines, a search of state business filings for anything connected. To Roger Danvers. It came back within a week. 8 months after Walter's death, Roger had formed a limited liability company called Lakeshore Ventures Holdings, registered to a P.O. box 2 towns over from where he and Carol lived. The LLC's sole listed manager was Roger. 6 weeks after Lakeshore Ventures Holdings was formed, it purchased a distressed rental property at auction for $58,000, almost precisely the sum. Once you accounted for closing costs that had been quietly bled out of the Whitfield Family Trust I, falsified withdrawal at a time. I sat with that ledger open in front of me, and I understood, fully, for the first time, what I had actually been watching for the past 3 years. It wasn't grief that made Carol cold toward me. It wasn't old sibling rivalry that made her cut me out of the trust meeting. It was cover. Every slight, every exclusion, every moment she'd pushed me an inch further outside the family's inner circle had been, whether she fully admitted it to herself or not, about making sure the one person in the family with the training to notice $61,000 missing dollars never got close enough to look. I didn't confront anyone that week, or the next, or the one after that. I've testified in enough courtrooms to know that the worst thing a person with real evidence can do is show their hand before they've built the case that makes the hand impossible to argue with. So, I kept building. I photographed every page of Walter's ledger and every trust statement, organized them chronologically, cross-referenced the 7 fraudulent withdrawals against the LLC formation date and the property purchase, and wrote a plain, dated summary of every finding the way I used to write them for opposing counsel, because I intended for a lawyer, and possibly a judge, to read it one day. Which brings us back to the dining room, and the slap, and the 6 words that told the whole family I didn't belong to them. That family gathering was Eleanor's father's would-be 90th birthday, a tradition the family had kept even after he passed. A dinner every year on his birthday to remember him. I'd finished my case 4 days earlier. I hadn't told Eleanor yet. I was still deciding how to bring $61,000 and a forged signature to the one person it would hurt the most before it helped her. Carol had been drinking a little more than usual that night, and grief does strange things to people around the anniversary of a death. So I want to be honest and say I don't think what happened next was entirely calculated. I think it was Carol, drunk on wine and old resentment, finally saying out loud what she'd apparently been telling herself in private for 3 years. Roger had made an offhand comment about family investments that made me look up sharply an old habit. The accountant's ear catching a word out of place, and Carol saw me look up, and something in her snapped. "What?" she said, loud enough that the table went quiet. "You think you get a say in this family's money? You're not even blood, Frank. You never have been." And then, before anyone could stop her, before I could even fully register what was happening, her hand came across my face, hard enough to snap my head to the side, hard enough that my grandson dropped his fork. "You're not even her real family," she said again, quieter now, shaking. "You just married in." I want to tell you what went through my mind in that silence, because it wasn't rage, even though I understood why everyone at that table expected it to be. What went through my mind was a strange, cold clarity, the same clarity I used to feel in a courtroom right before I laid a spreadsheet in front of a jury. I looked at Carol, at her shaking hand still raised slightly from the slap, and I thought, "You have no idea how much of your marriage and your freedom is currently sitting in a manila folder on my kitchen table." I didn't say that. I didn't say anything cruel. I've spent my whole career learning that the moment you let anger drive the case, you lose the jury. What I said calmly, in a voice that surprised even me with how steady it was this, "Carol, I think we should talk about the trust. All of us. With Eleanor's attorney present. This week." Carol laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Talk about what? There's nothing to talk about." "There's $61,000 to talk about," I said. "And a rental property in Roger's name that I don't think you know about yet." The room went very still. Roger's face did something I'll remember for the rest of my life, the particular color a man's face turns when he realizes, all at once, that the ground he's been standing on for 3 years was never solid. I didn't say another word that night. I finished my water, I helped my grandson pick his fork up off the floor, and I drove Eleanor home in silence. Because some things a wife needs to hear without an audience, and without her sister's voice cutting across the truth before it's even finished being spoken. I told Eleanor everything the next morning, at our own kitchen table, with Walter's ledger open between us the way it had been every night for 11 months. I want to tell you honestly that this was the hardest conversation of our marriage, harder than any argument we'd ever had. Because I wasn't just handing her proof that her sister and brother-in-law had stolen from their father's estate. I was handing her proof that her own signature, the mark of her identity, the thing she'd trusted her whole family to respect, had been forged 7 times by people who shared her blood. She cried for a long time. Then she went quiet in a way I'd never seen her go quiet before, and she asked me one question. "How long have you known?" 11 months, I said. I needed to be certain before I brought this to you. I needed it to be a fact, not a feeling. She nodded slowly, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, not just grief, but a kind of recognition. She understood, in that moment, fully, the way I had understood it 3 weeks earlier over that ledger, every slight I'd absorbed for 3 years. Every time she'd apologized on Carol's behalf for some small exclusion, every "she doesn't mean it, she's just going through a lot," all of it had been armor Carol built, consciously or not, around a theft she couldn't afford to have discovered. It wasn't that Carol didn't think I was real family. It was that she couldn't afford for real family to be paying attention. We called the estate attorney, a careful, unhurried man named Peter Aldous, who had drafted Walter's original trust and who, I could tell from the tightness in his voice on the phone, took forged fiduciary signatures very personally. He explained something to Eleanor that I already knew, but that she needed to hear from someone other than her own husband. A trustee has a fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries of a trust, a legal obligation to act with total honesty and in the beneficiary's best interest. And any trustee who authorizes a withdrawal for undisclosed personal benefit, let alone one who forges a co-trustee's signature. To do it has committed a serious breach of that duty, one that can be pursued both in civil court, to recover the stolen funds with interest, and potentially referred to the state attorney general's office, which in most states maintains oversight over trust and estate matters specifically because family trusts are so easy to quietly loot without anyone outside the family noticing until it's far too late. Peter mentioned, almost in passing, that if it came to that, the AG's Consumer and Trust Protection Unit had an investigator he'd worked with on 2 prior cases, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Detective Marsh, who he said doesn't like being handed a mess. She likes being handed a file, and I remember thinking, even then, that I intended to hand her the cleanest file she'd ever seen. Peter also explained something Eleanor needed to hear in plain terms, without the legal dressing, because it's the one line that makes this whole story make sense, even if you've never read a page of trust law in your life. A trust is just a promise, written down, that says the person managing someone else's money will act like it's their own family's future on the line, because it is. When that promise gets broken quietly enough, for long enough, most families never find out until the money's already gone and spent. The only reason this one got caught was that somebody in the family knew how to read a ledger the way Walter had written it honestly, one true number at a time. Peter asked to see everything. I brought him the ledger, the bank statements, the photographed signatures side by side under magnification, the LLC filing, the property deed. He went quiet for a long time reading through it, and then he said something I've thought about often since. In 30 years of doing this work, Frank, I have never once seen a family member build a case this clean on their own. Most people bring me suspicion. You brought me a closing argument. Peter called for a formal trust accounting, meeting a legal right any beneficiary or co-trustee has to demand a full accounting of trust transactions, and one Carol, as co-trustee, could not legally refuse without raising immediate suspicion in front of the very attorney who drafted her father's trust. He scheduled it for the following week, in his office, with Carol and Roger required to attend alongside Eleanor and myself. I want to take a breath here and tell you about the days between that phone call and that meeting, because they weren't triumphant. I didn't feel like a man about to win something. I felt like a man about to watch his wife lose a sister, even if that sister had already lost herself somewhere over the past 3 years. There's a particular kind of grief in proving someone you love has been lying to you, and I watched Eleanor carry that grief quietly all week, staring at old photographs of her and Carol as girls, looking for the moment things had started to go wrong. The way you look for the exact spot a crack started in a foundation. The morning of the meeting, I sat in my car in the parking lot outside Peter Aldis's office 15 minutes early, and I opened Walter's ledger one last time, not to check a number, but because I wanted his handwriting in front of me before I did this. Walter had built something honest, one handwritten column at a time, for 50 years, and I was about to hand his careful record keeping back to his family as a weapon against the people who'd betrayed it. I understood, sitting there, that I wasn't really the one delivering justice. Walter was. I was just the one who'd finally learned to read what he'd already written down. Inside, Carol looked like she hadn't slept. Roger looked worse, the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent a week rehearsing explanations he already knows won't hold up. Peter began the meeting formally, reading each beneficiary their rights under the trust, and then he asked Carol directly to account for 7 specific withdrawals totaling $61,200. Carol's first answer was that the withdrawals were for legitimate trust expenses she'd approved as co-trustee. Peter asked calmly why each authorization bore Eleanor's signature if Carol alone had approved them. Carol said Eleanor must have signed them and forgotten. Peter turned to Eleanor, who said, quietly but clearly, that she had never seen a single one of those 7 documents before this week. That's when I laid the signatures out Eleanor's real signature beside all 7 withdrawal authorizations, magnified. The hitch in the capital E identical 7 times over, a consistency no living hand produces. I explained it the way I'd explain it to a jury of people with no accounting background at all, because that's the discipline of the work. If you can't make it simple enough for anyone in the room to understand, you haven't finished your job. A real signature, I said, changes a little every time, because a real hand is never perfectly steady. A traced signature repeats itself exactly, because it isn't being written, it's being copied. These 7 signatures repeat themselves exactly. Eleanor's real signature never has, not once, in 35 years of marriage. Roger tried to speak then, and what came out of him wasn't really a defense, it was closer to a confession, dressed up as an explanation. He talked about a business opportunity that had seemed certain, a rental property that was supposed to generate income that would have quietly replaced the borrowed money before anyone noticed. A plan that had made perfect sense in his head at 2 in the morning with his gambling debts pressing in on him from every side. I watched him talk, and for one strange moment, I felt something close to pity for him, not enough to excuse what he'd done, but enough to understand it. A desperate man convinces himself a theft is a loan. He convinces himself the loan will be repaid before it's ever discovered. He is very often wrong. Carol sat through Roger's explanation with her hands flat on the table, staring at a point somewhere past his shoulder, and when he finally stopped talking, she said one sentence that I believe was the most honest thing she'd said in 3 years. I knew something was wrong, and I let myself not ask. Peter, to his credit, didn't rush past that admission. He let it sit in the room for a moment, the same way I'd learned to let a hard number sit before building the next conclusion on top of it, because some truths need a breath of their own before anyone can move forward. Peter let him finish. Then he explained plainly what happens next under the law. As co-trustee, Carol would be formally removed from her role, effective immediately. A process available to any court when a trustee is shown to have breached their fiduciary duty. The trust would pursue recovery of the full $61,200 plus interest, with the rental property itself available as an asset to satisfy that judgment, since it had been purchased directly with the misappropriated funds, and given the deliberate forgery involved. Peter had an independent obligation to refer the matter to the State Attorney General's office, which oversees exactly this kind of trust misconduct, for them to determine whether criminal charges were warranted alongside the civil recovery. I watched Carol's face while Peter said all of this, and I want to be honest with you about what I saw, because it wasn't the vindication I might have expected to feel. I saw a woman finally understanding that the fight she'd been having with her sister since she was 7 years old had cost her something she could never get back, not the money, which could at least partially be recovered, but the last few years she could have spent as Eleanor's sister instead of Eleanor's rival. That was the moment I understood fully what this whole story had actually been about. It was never really about a will or a slap or even the $61,000. It was about a woman so afraid of being the daughter who mattered less that she destroyed the one thing that could have proven her father right about loving both his girls equally, the honest, careful trust he'd built specifically because he trusted his daughters to manage it together. The plot resolved that day in Peter's office, with documents signed and a referral made. But the real ending of this story didn't happen that day at all, and it didn't happen quickly. For the first 2 weeks after that meeting, Carol didn't call. She didn't answer when Eleanor called her. She sent one text, "I need space. This isn't as simple as you think," and then nothing. And I watched Eleanor check her phone 40 times a day for a sister who wasn't ready to be found yet. I understood that silence better than Eleanor did, I think. I've watched plenty of people sitting across from me in a deposition spend the first 2 weeks after being caught still hunting for a version of events where they're not entirely the villain. Carol needed those 2 weeks. Nobody unravels 3 years of self-justification in an afternoon, and I told Eleanor more than once that Carol's silence wasn't proof she felt nothing, it was proof she was finally feeling all of it at once, with nowhere left to put it. It was Carol who finally called in the 3rd week, and what she asked for wasn't forgiveness. She asked, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, if she could come see the ledger. Not us. Not an apology dinner. The ledger. I think some part of her needed to see her father's own handwriting laid out plainly, uncorrupted by anything she or Roger had touched, before she could let herself believe what the numbers actually said about her. Eleanor and I hosted a small dinner, not the whole extended family, just us, and Carol, alone, without Roger. Carol had asked for it. She sat at our kitchen table, the same table where Walter's ledger had lived for 11 months, and she cried in a way I hadn't seen from her since our own children were small and she used to babysit them, back before all of this. She apologized to Eleanor first, a long, halting apology about every slight, every excluded photograph, every meeting scheduled behind her back, admitting finally that all of it had been about keeping me from looking too closely, and that some deeper, uglier part of her had also simply enjoyed, for once in her life, having something that felt like more than her sister had. Then she turned to me. She didn't slap me this time. She reached out and put her hand, gently, over the same cheek she'd struck a little over a month earlier, and she said, "You were the only one who was ever really paying attention to any of it. I think some part of me always knew that, and I hated you for it, because it meant you noticed how much I was disappearing." I told her I forgave her, because I did, and because Walter would have wanted his daughters to find their way back to each other more than he would have wanted revenge carried out in his name. I told her the money mattered less to me than watching her and Eleanor become sisters again instead of 2 women guarding half a trust apiece. I meant every word of it. We sat at that table for a long time after that, the 3 of us, and at some point Eleanor got up and brought out an old photo album. One Walter had kept in his study, full of pictures of 2 little girls in matching Easter dresses standing in front of the hardware store their father was so proud of. Carol laughed, wet-eyed, at a photo of herself at 7 years old, missing her 2 front teeth, glaring at the camera because Eleanor had gotten to hold the family dog first. "I've been having that same fight my whole life," Carol said quietly, tracing the edge of the photograph with one finger. I just finally found a way to lose it completely. Eleanor reached over and took her sister's hand across the table, the same table where I'd spent 11 months building the case that was now, finally, allowed to become something softer than evidence. Roger's outcome was less gentle and less redemptive, because a man who forges a signature 7 times isn't offered the same grace as a woman drowning in grief and rivalry. The Attorney General's investigator who took the referral was Detective Marsh, the same sharp, no-nonsense woman Peter had mentioned by name weeks earlier. And she called me twice over the following month, not because she needed my testimony yet, but because she wanted to make sure the documentation trail I'd built would hold up cleanly if the case ever went to trial. It did. 6 weeks after the referral, facing both the civil judgment for restitution and a criminal charge of forgery connected to a fiduciary breach, Roger accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a jury seeing the side-by-side signatures the way that family meeting had seen them. The agreement carried a felony conviction, a restitution order requiring him to forfeit the rental property outright and repay the remaining balance over 5 years, and a formal end to any role, formal or informal, in the family's financial affairs going forward. He sold his truck to make the first restitution payment. I heard about that detail secondhand from my daughter, and I felt no satisfaction in it at all, only a tired, quiet confirmation that desperate plans very rarely land the way desperate men picture them landing at 2 in the morning. Carol filed for divorce 4 months later. She kept the house, the modest one she and Roger had bought early in their marriage, long before Lakeshore Ventures Holdings ever existed. She went back to work part-time at a school office, something she hadn't done in over a decade, and she told Eleanor once, over coffee, that getting up for a job again was the first time in years she'd felt like herself instead of like someone auditioning for her father's approval from beyond the grave. She rebuilt something with Eleanor, slowly, the way you rebuild anything that's been cracked for years, not all at once, but board by board. The way Walter used to replace the dock at the lake cottage 1 plank at a time every spring instead of tearing the whole thing out. I still have Walter's ledger. It sits on a shelf in my study now, not in a drawer anymore, out where I can see it. Sometimes, on Sunday evenings, the way Walter used to call me just to talk about the stock market, I open it and look at his handwriting, steady and careful across 50 years of columns, and I think about how a man who never once raised his voice in anger managed to protect his daughters from across the grave, simply by keeping honest records and trusting one of us to eventually learn how to. Read them. Last month, at our first family dinner since everything settled, Carol stood up and gave a toast. She talked about her father for almost 5 minutes, and this time she said his name 11 times. I counted. Eleanor cried. My grandson, older now, asked me afterward why Grandma Carol used to be so angry all the time, and I told him the truth, in words small enough for him to hold, that sometimes people hurt the ones closest to them because they're afraid of feeling like they don't matter, and that the bravest thing a person can do isn't getting angry back, it's staying patient long enough to find the truth, and honest enough to forgive what the truth reveals. If you're 65, 70, 80 years old, and somebody in your own family has ever looked you in the eye and told you that you don't really belong to them, that you're not blood, not real, not owed a seat at the table, I want you to hear this from someone who's lived it. The people who need you gone from the room are very often the people who most need you not to notice what they're doing in it. Pay attention anyway. Keep your own ledger, whatever form yours takes: a notebook, a folder of statements, a memory for dates and numbers that doesn't let go. And never mistake someone else's cruelty for the final word on where you belong. A slap in a dining room lasts 1 second. 31 years of showing up lasts a lifetime, and in the end, it's the 31 years that gets the final say. What would you have done in that dining room in front of your own grandchildren? Would you have raised your voice back, or would you have gone home and started reading the numbers? Tell me in the comments, and tell me your age. I read every single one of them. Before you go, I want to tell you about somebody I met through a reader's letter last year, a retired Army supply sergeant named Harold, 81 years old, who spent 40 years believing his son had quietly arranged his veterans' benefits and his modest pension the right way, the honest way, the way a son who respects his father's service is supposed to. Harold found out almost by accident, flipping through a benefit statement he wasn't supposed to see, that somebody close to him had been signing his name to paperwork he'd never laid eyes on, and that whoever it was had been counting on an old man's trust in his own family lasting a lot longer than it should have. Harold spent 30 years defending a country that taught him how to read a situation before it read him. I don't think whoever did this to him understood, until it was much too late, exactly who they were dealing with. That story is coming soon, and trust me, when a man who trained soldiers for 4 decades finally decides to fight back, it isn't quiet, and it isn't quick.